I'm Dr. Hermson in the Social Department. On behalf of the Colloquium Committee, we want to thank JT or I should say, Dr. Thomas for agreeing to come today. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Breckus, who's going to give the formal introduction.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Wayne Breckus in the Sociology Department. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. JT Thomas. JT is a Kansas City, Missouri native. He received his BA, his MA, and his PhD degrees from the University of Missouri. He's currently an associate professor of sociology at the University of Mississippi. He completed his dissertation at the University of Missouri in 2011. I and Dr. David Brunsma were his advisors. His dissertation was a 3-site ethnography focused on the role of stand-up comedy venues in the production of contentious politics. He has published many scholarly articles and multiple books, including, well, one that came out of his dissertation was, I don't know if you can see this very well, but Working to Laugh, Assembling Difference in American Stand-Up Comedy Clubs with Lexington Press. Then he also co-authored with another Mizzou alum, Jennifer Correa. He co-authored Affective Labor, Disassembling Difference and Distance with Roman and Littlefield, and was co-author of Are Racists Crazy? How Prejudice, Racism, and Anti-Semitism Became Markers of Insanity with NYU Press. And he also has this recent book, Diversity Regimes, Why Talk is Not Enough to Fix Racial Inequality at Universities, with Rutgers University Press. And I'll send a link to the ebook that our library has of that book. I'll send that in the chat once I finish the introduction. In addition to his multiple scholarly academic publications, JT is also a fearless public sociologist who speaks truth to power even where it is extremely unpopular and even sometimes dangerous to do so. He has come under political fire for his sociological editorials demanding that Confederate monuments be taken down, and for his participation in a scholars' strike protesting racism, police brutality, and social injustice, a participation that led the Mississippi State Auditor to send investigators to his home and to subpoena his emails and syllabi. He is on a top 10 list that some right-wing groups put together, which includes Angela Davis and Cornel West. So that's a pretty good top 10 list to be among. And he's a highly analytic scholar and a true public sociologist with a strong interest in sociological analysis and social justice. JT's talk today is entitled The Souls of Jews, How the Jewish Question Haunts Du Bois' Theory of Black Double Consciousness. So welcome, JT. It's great to see you again. Great to have you back at Mizzou virtually. And it's great to see people from, I mean, I guess one thing about this virtual is I see people here from California and Virginia and lots of different places. So welcome.
Yeah. Wayne, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. That was really kind of you. Let me thank, before I get into kind of the meat of the talk, I need to thank the University of Massachusetts at Amherst Department of Special Collections and University Archives and their W.E.B. Du Bois Center, and then the center's director, Professor Whitney Battle Baptiste. The work I'm going to present today wouldn't have been possible without a residential fellowship that I received through the Du Bois Center back in 2017. And then I also want to just thank the Department of Sociology at the University of Missouri. One, for extending the opportunity to come and share my work. I'm I'm really grateful for that opportunity, but probably more so, I think I want to thank you all just for the training and mentorship that I received while I was there as a student. I've said it then, and I'll say it every day to anybody who will listen. I believe it's second to none. Okay, so let's start in March of 1897. W.E.B. Du Bois is just 29 years old, and he's given this keynote at the first annual gathering of the American Negro Academy. And his keynote is entitled The Conservation of the Races. And in it, he asks his audience the following: am I an American or am I a Negro? Can I be both? Or is it my duty to cease to be a Negro as soon as possible and be an American? If I strive as a Negro, am I not perpetuating the very cleft that threatens and separates Black and white America? Is not my only possible practical aim the subduction of all that is Negro in me to the American? And does my Black blood place upon me any more obligation to assert my nationality than German or Irish or Italian blood would? 5 months later, Du Bois is going to write an essay for the Atlantic Monthly entitled Strivings of the Negro People. And it's in this essay that he names the condition that he identified in his previous talk. He writes, and I'm sure this passage is going to be familiar to many of you. He writes, after the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And then 6 years after that Atlantic essay, he's going to revise and republish it in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, and the rest, of course, is history. So there's been a resurgence of interest in W.E.B. Du Bois within sociology, and this renewed interest appears guided by at least two objectives that I can tell. First is to center Du Bois's role in establishing sociology as an empirically driven social science. And then the second objective seems to be to better articulate Du Bois's contributions to contemporary studies of race and racism. My research is motivated by similar desires. I'm very interested in the intellectual underpinnings of Du Bois's most widely cited contribution to the sociology of race, his concept of Black double consciousness. And broadly, what I argue in this research is that Du Bois's time as a student at the University of Berlin from 1892 to 1894 exposed him to the intellectual and political roots of late 19th century German anti-Semitism. And it's this exposure to anti-Semitism, as well as his consideration of Germany's Jewish question, that shapes his theorizing of Black double consciousness. So by situating Du Bois's concept of double consciousness within this socio-political and intellectual context of Western European anti-Semitism, that goal here is to add an important and to date missing context to Du Bois's own intellectual history. To date, no scholarship that I'm aware of fully explores whether and how Du Bois's reflections on anti-Semitism inform or shape his subsequent considerations of Black duality. My other aim here is what I hope to do is to help to advance a comparative framework through which we can theorize the relationship between Western European anti-Semitism and American anti-Black racism. Many scholars explore these racial projects as distinct phenomenon, but few analyze their connectedness. But if we look across much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, over that period, Jewish and Black people were the primary vehicles through which the political and social interests of white supremacy were advanced. Late 19th century German Jews and Black Americans provided the means through which German and American strains of white Christian nationalism expressed themselves. So analyzing the intellectual and socio-political roots of Du Bois's concept of double consciousness can help us to understand how those two racial projects became conjoined. And it can also give us an entry point for examining how Jews and Black Americans respond similarly to and differently to manifestations of white supremacy in Western Europe and in the United States. Now, here's the rub. Du Bois's intellectual history spans more than 7 decades. And this presents challenges in identifying what Paul Gilroy would call the roots and the routes of Du Bois's intellectual thought. Du Bois's own thinking and writing involved several significant shifts over his lifetime, as did the socio-political environment in which he lived and worked. So I want to be very clear here. I don't make any claims about any consistency in Du Boisian thought. My focus instead is on a single Du Boisian idea, double consciousness, and its roots and its routes from late 19th century Germany and its Jewish question to mid 20th century America. So for more than a century, scholars have analyzed, discussed, and debated the meaning of double consciousness the way that Du Bois uses it. Most recently, the sociologists Jose Itzgon and Corita Brown have argued that as a central structural condition of contemporary race relations, Du Bois's theory of double consciousness demonstrates how racialized groups are prohibited from having their full humanity recognized. Others have read into double consciousness a positive reaction to those kinds of constraints. So facing violent segregation and suppression in post-Reconstruction America, double consciousness was understood as an adoptive and adaptive inward orientation that was meant to strengthen Black institutions and focus Black Americans toward collective uplift. And then elsewhere, the cultural theorist Paul Gilroy has read double consciousness as emerging from what he calls an unhappy symbiosis between three Black ways of knowing. One that is racially particularistic, another that derives from recognizing that you as a Black American are a not yet citizen in the nation to which you belong, and then another one as diasporic or even universal in its linkages to a global Black experience that's always defined through its relationship to white supremacy. Du Bois no doubt drew upon a wide variety of sources in how he understood double consciousness. For much of the 19th century, the Western philosophical tradition gave great consideration to the self as a kind of contingent duality, threatened by forces of industrialization, urbanization, corresponding cultural changes that required new modes of sociality. And that influence is most evident in Du Bois's use of double consciousness to describe the effect on Black Americans, who are increasingly pulled into the center of the narrative of post-emancipation America, but they're never really truly embraced as co-authors of that narrative. Now, as I said, my own interests are in the socio-political roots and routes of this concept. And what I'm going to argue is that double consciousness is more than just a theory of race or racism. It's a political theory that's meant to describe the limits of citizenship and belonging for non-white, non-Christian groups within a white Christian racial state. So Du Bois arrives in Germany in 1892 for this 2-year postdoc at what was then commonly known as the University of Berlin. And at the time, the University of Berlin was the largest university within the German academic system. And Du Bois's arrival in Berlin was part of this broader transatlantic academic migration, where as many as 9,000 American students and scholars between roughly 1820 and 1920 are going to go and study abroad in Germany. And this includes many of Du Bois's mentors from Harvard University. On the one hand, Du Bois arrives in Germany as Germany is on the tail end of unprecedented reform to its economic and political landscape. So just during Du Bois's 2-year stay, Germany is going to complete a decade of state-sponsored economic and labor reform that had no historical parallel. And like much of Western Europe, Germany's also undergoing rapid industrialization and urbanization. So also during Du Bois's 2-year stay, Germany is going to pass from a predominantly rural to a predominantly urban demographic base. Lots of farmers from poor Eastern provinces are going to begin to flood German cities in search of wage labor. On the other hand, Du Bois's arrival in Germany also coincides with the spike in political anti-Semitism that was unmatched until Hitler's ascendance. The 1878 elections had brought a significant increase in conservative members to the German parliament, and that included the newly formed Christian Social Party. And the Christian Social Party was anti-Semitic from its birth. Its platform in 1878 declared, "We respect the Jews as fellow citizens and honor Judaism as the lower stage of divine revelation, but we firmly believe that no Jew can be a leader of Christian workers in either a religious or economic capacity." By the 1880s, the Christian Social Party's platform began to link anti-capitalism with hatred toward the Jews, and it began to promote a global Jewish conspiracy to exterminate the German character or national culture. By 1892, when Du Bois arrives in Germany, public meetings in which Jews were denounced as a menace to German society were a near daily occurrence. In 1893, Germany experiences a very sharp economic recession that resulted in the largest vote for political anti-Semitism in the history of the German Empire. Now, despite the collapse of most anti-Semitic parties in the next election, German Jews remained under constant attacks that questioned their patriotism and their loyalty. By the late 19th century, German notions of a unified national culture were increasingly defined through collective hatred of Germany's Jews. And Du Bois recognized this tendency within German nationalism. In 1893, he writes an essay on the state of German politics, and this is what he says. German industry is largely in the hands of the Jews, and this brings into the strife something of class and race antipathies. It may surprise one at first to see a recrudescence of anti-Jewish feeling in a civilized state at this late day. One must learn, however, that the basis of neo-anti-Semitism is economic and its end is socialism, and only its present motive force is racial hatred. And it's important here to note how closely Du Bois's language in this essay parallels the language of the liberal German Social Democratic's own 1893 platform resolution. So the Social Democratic Party of Germany in 1893 stated anti-Semitism springs from the discontent of certain bourgeois strata who find themselves adversely affected by the development of capitalism and are in part destined to decline through this development. They go on to say the exploitation of man by man is not a specifically Jewish form of livelihood, but one peculiar to bourgeois society, which will end only with the decline of bourgeois society. So though anti-Semitism manifests as racial hatred, both Du Bois and the German Social Democratic Party saw it as misplaced class antagonism. And both believed that socialist economic reforms would resolve those class antagonisms. They would lead to a reduction in anti-Semitism and then the incorporation of the Jew into the German body politic. Decades later, though, Du Bois is going to reflect again upon this period of late 19th century German nationalism in his autobiography. And he's going to compare it to his New England upbringing, where he says patriotism in New England was cool and intellectual. And when he's in Germany, he says he's taken aback by the pageantry and patriotism. He says, when I heard my German companions sing Germany, Germany, above all else in the world, I realized that they felt something I had never felt and perhaps never would. I began to feel the dichotomy, which all my life has characterized my thought. How far can love for my oppressed race accord with love for the oppressing country? And when these loyalties diverge, where shall my soul find refuge? So Du Bois, in his own reflections, recognizes among his German companions this kind of singular collective consciousness. And then he contrasts that with his own internal conflict between love for a Black collective and love for a country that oppresses it. Indeed, to be Black in post-emancipation America is to ever feel one's two-ness, or as he puts it later, the Black man is a person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia. Of course, Du Bois acknowledges differences that remain between Germany's Jews and Black Americans. So writing in his diary when he's returning to the United States in 1894, he admits that the Jews' national development is over widely different obstacles than those of my nation. Yet both Jews and Black Americans face similar challenges in fully incorporating into their respective nation states. The German Jew, like the Black American, lacks opportunities to develop a cultured and economically secure middle class, but for different reasons. In his autobiography, Du Bois suggests a more immutable and irreconcilable antagonism, that between a national German culture that's built upon racial and ethnic homogeneity, and then a Jewish national culture that's derived from the experience of always and forever being positioned outside of and against the spirit or the soul of that nation. So if the socio-political climate of late 19th century Germany provides Du Bois with kind of a comparative lens through which to consider Black double consciousness, I also argue here that the University of Berlin specifically gave Du Bois a kind of critical distance from the color line that was impossible within the racial caste system of 19th century America. But at the same time, the University of Berlin was an incubator of some of the strongest currents of racialism anywhere in the Western world. And these dual contexts give new meaning to Du Bois's own account of his German academic adventures, where he writes in Dusk of Dawn, he says, under these teachers and in this social setting, I began to see the race problem in America, the problem of the peoples of Africa and Asia, and the political development of Europe as one. The The University of Berlin and German academia more generally was somewhat of a ground zero for 19th century medical and social scientific discourse on Jewish and Black inferiority. Many of Western Europe's most prominent racialists were located within German systems of higher education, and there was general consensus among them that Jews and African Americans were predisposed to madness and unable to acculturate. Even so-called German progressives contributed to this kind of anti-Semitic scientific rationale. Indeed, what would set apart self-avowed German anti-Semites from those who didn't consider themselves anti-Semitic, it wasn't their perceptions of Jewish inferiority, because they shared those. It was rather what should be done about it. For German academics who expressed sympathies toward Germany's Jews, they often did so through appeals to a united German national culture that asked its Jews to suppress all that was Jewish in order for Germany to attain its full potential. Then there were other academics that Du Bois encountered, like Heinrich von Treitschke, who were just far less civil. Treitschke was a historian who Du Bois called by far the most interesting of his professors under whom he studied. By Du Bois's arrival in Berlin, Treitschke had become somewhat of a German institution. His lectures frequently drew the largest audience of any course that was taught at the university. But he was also a Proto-Aryan nationalist. He had been an avid supporter of the Christian Social Party. By the 1870s, he was on record criticizing Germany's Jews as an element of national decomposition. He claimed they wreaked havoc upon an emergent German nationalism. He wrote an 1879 pamphlet where he said, in the circles of educated Germans who would protest indignantly against the charge of religious and national intolerance, one single cry is heard: the Jews are our misfortune. And that phrase, of course, would become a popular rallying cry for anti-Semitism in later decades. So even at the university of his dreams, which is what the University of Berlin was to Du Bois, he could still have no illusions that it was free from prejudice. His private letters and his notes reveal him actively grappling with what similarities, if any, German anti-Semitism shared with anti-Black racism. So in a letter, for instance, providing an update on his academic progress to the Slater Fund, which was his benefactor, in 1893, Du Bois writes, "Beside my regular work, I've been following the political movements of the country, the rise of anti-Semitism, which has much in common with our own race question and is of considerable interest to me." And then later, in a draft of what would become his posthumous autobiography, Du Bois recites this incident that happened as a student. I'm gonna read it aloud. He says, "The Independent Student Association had been holding a number of meetings lately in the auditorium of the university. The Jews, who were not admitted into the social clubs, and the socialist students captured one of the meetings and had things their own way. And this aroused a perfect furor among the German nationalist students, among whom a strong and even bitter anti-Semitic feeling is developing. They called a meeting in the same hall, but Rector Virchow refused to allow it, fearing that the breach among the students would become too great. Whereupon the honored professor received some disrespectful manifestations in his recitation room, and the meeting was called in an outside hall. There were upwards of 700 students present, seated along rows of tables, smoking and drinking beer. The assembly disported itself in condemning Jews in no uncertain terms, even showing marked discourtesy to several speakers who sought to defend the Jews. The meeting ended in smoke and song, and afterward I went to a socialist meeting as a fit conclusion to the day." So what's striking about these accounts is that despite his reporting of widespread anti-Semitism, Du Bois also described Germany as this is what he says, "the land where I first met white folk who treated me as a human being." To be clear, Du Bois's Blackness was not absent to his German interlocutors, and Du Bois was not ignorant of anti-Black racism in Europe at the time. Still, for Du Bois, Germany represented a greater, broader sense of humanity and fellowship. He says, "I felt myself standing not against the world, but simply against American narrowness and color prejudice, with the greater, finer world at my back urging me on." So if we take Du Bois at his own word, the University of Berlin provided him with a critical distance from the duality that marked his own Black American experience. In his own personal notebook in February of 1894, shortly before he comes back to the United States, he writes, "I'm here free from most of those iron bands that bound me at home, away from the physical provincialism of America and the psychological provincialism of my rather narrow race problem into which I was born, and which seemed to me the essence of life. This momentary escape, he's talking about Germany, this momentary escape from my own social problems is an introduction to new cultural patterns. Then in Souls of Black Folk, he's going to describe how as a student in Europe, he didn't feel the presence of the veil, and that he was therefore able to rise above the color line. And then decades later in Dusk of Dawn, he's going to reveal again how his desire to understand the color line and the plight of Black Americans was seated in his studies in Germany. So there's no question that the period in which Du Bois studied in Germany was one in which German anti-Semitism was at a fever pitch. And Du Bois's own accounts of his time in Germany, including at the University of Berlin, show that he's actively considering Germany's Jewish question, including what parallels, if any, it shares with anti-Black racism in America. And Du Bois understood that there was a double problem in German nationalism of the late 19th century. On the one hand, German nationalism enables Jews to function in German society because there's a desire to see a strong, unified Germany. So they're allowed, for instance, to enter into certain kinds of professions. On the other hand, German nationalism prevents Jews from ever being seen as real Germans. They can't serve in the civil service. Du Bois then sees the success of German Jews in the face of anti-Semitism as both the source of a developing Jewish national character, and then also as the source of an anti-Semitic German national character with which German Jews have to contend. And so if we go back to that 1893 essay on German politics, he says, it must ever be remembered that the great capitalists of Germany, the great leaders of industry, are Jews. Banded together by oppression in the past, they work for each other. And aided by the vast power of their wealth and their natural abilities, they have forced citadel after citadel. And this, of course, is a menace to the newly nationalized country. So rather than say that Jews are an inferior racial stock, like so many of his contemporaries, Du Bois sees in them a kind of a striving, including a modicum of success in spite of prevailing anti-Semitism. The problem with German nationalism for Du Bois is not with the German Jew, it's in the condition of the collective German psyche. He writes in that same essay, an all-pervading restless pessimism exhibits itself now in a beautiful and practical idealism and in a caring cynicism. The whole nation, in spite of excellent qualities, seems largely to lack that robust faith in itself, which builds men and peoples. Instead of a boundlessly optimistic state founded on individual freedom, we have a restlessly pessimistic state founded on obedience. So German Jews' economic success in spite of anti-Semitism becomes the well from which further anti-Semitic German nationalist feelings will spring. Du Bois is going to write, all that Marx and Blanc or Bellamy ever laid at the door of capitalism is, by the German anti-Semitic party, charged upon the Jew, because the Jew happens to be the great capitalist of Germany. So Du Bois sees in the status of German Jews the economic, political, and social factors that he later also sees as central to the status of Blacks in the United States and key to the duration and formation of Black double consciousness. Many decades later, Du Bois has this semi-regular column in the Chicago Defender called The Winds of Time, and in it, he's going to write similarly about Black Americans who were fighting abroad in World War II on behalf of an America that still insisted upon their unequal status when they returned from war. So in this column, he notes the many accomplishments of Black American servicemen, the number of Black Americans enrolled in college at the time, the accumulation of Black American wealth at the time, but he writes, but when with joyful faces we turn from this, we turn to a world still persisting in the discrimination which we know all too well. Now, while Du Bois's reflections on Germany's Jewish question show clear parallels with his reflections on the challenges that face Black Americans, there are important differences. Despite Jews' inability to fully assimilate, Du Bois does note that they achieved some economic success in Germany. They had even achieved political emancipation, including suffrage, nearly 3 decades prior to when he arrives in Berlin. So it's not unreasonable to conclude that Jewish duality in late 19th century Germany is conditioned by a German nationalism that resents their success, whereas Black American duality results from an American nationalism that prevents them from obtaining any economic or political power. Yet, even if German nationalism arises from a collective resentment of Jews' success, which is a questionable claim in itself, it still rests upon an underlying assumption that this success is undeserved because Jews are not really German. Likewise, Black Americans' inability to achieve full citizenship in the post-emancipation United States rests upon a similar underlying assumption, that their Blackness makes them unworthy of incorporation. In both instances, then, Jews and Black Americans serve as a racialized other against which German and American nationalism express themselves. And it's this political quality of two-ness that I argue structures Du Bois's theorizing of double consciousness. He was a student of Germany since his days at Fisk as an undergraduate, and he already had, even then, recognized the parallels. Later, as a master's candidate at Harvard, he's going to argue that the racial caste system of the American South differs in degree only from that in Germany, England, or even in Massachusetts. So taking in the political, social, and intellectual climate of late 19th century Germany is going to allow Du Bois, even if only temporarily, to remove the veil. And that opportunity to take stock of his Blackness as belonging to a larger human condition, that was simply impossible in the United States. The opportunity that Berlin afforded Du Bois to play the role of, we could call it, critical distant observer, that no doubt developed his analytic lens through which he could examine the Jewish question in Europe and then draw comparisons with the plight of Black Americans. So in notes that he compiled for his autobiography, he says, "We studied history and politics almost exclusively from the point of view of ancient German freedom, English and New England democracy, and the development of the white United States. Here, however, I could bring criticism from what I knew and saw touching the Negro." Indeed, the impossibility of such criticism in his own country is made clear when Du Bois returns to the United States in 1894 after his funding dries up. He writes in his notebook, "A disturbed world in which I landed. 1892 saw the high tide of lynching in the United States. Cleveland had entered his second term in 1893 and the Chicago Exposition had taken place. The Dreyfus case in France had opened with his conviction and imprisonment, and he was destined for 12 years to suffer martyrdom." So for Du Bois, whatever reprieve Germany offered him, that reprieve was soon gone by the time he gets back to the United States. Now, it's become commonplace to assert that Du Bois never returns to his concept of double consciousness post-Souls. I would argue, however, that he routinely returns to the structural features of double consciousness that define the conditions of post-emancipation Black America. And that would be the veil, duality, or the concept of two-ness, and then the concept of second sight. Despite the rapid resurgence of violent anti-Semitism post-World War I and then Hitler's attempted genocide of Jews during World War II, Du Bois's reflections on anti-Semitism were much more uneven after the publication of Souls of Black Folk. It's not until after Du Bois's 1936 visit to Nazi Germany that he compares what he calls the vindictive cruelty and public insult of the Nazi regime with such horrors as the Spanish Inquisition and the African slave trade. So an important question we might ask is, what is the role of the Jew in Du Bois' post-Soul consideration of duality and double consciousness? Does double consciousness maintain its theoretical importance in a post-civil rights context in which political emancipation and civil rights are codified and in which American Jews become fully incorporated? A close reading reveals that Du Bois, after the publication of the Souls of Black Folk, his theorizing of Black American duality emphasizes the role of a racialized social structure that produces for both Black Americans and whites a debilitating condition that prevents either group from recognizing their humanity. Now, some of Du Bois's contemporaries are going to borrow from his conceptualization of duality, but most are going to fail to adequately recognize the role played by a racialized social structure in the continued marginalization of minority groups. So Jews' marginality, for instance, is going to be understood by many in the early to mid 20th century as a pathological indicator of their inability to assimilate into their host nations. But Du Bois is going to see the veil, or this racialized social structure, as constraining Black Americans from recognizing themselves except through the eyes of others. So in a 1950 draft of a manuscript, Du Bois is going to discuss what, if any, way forward exists for Black Americans who continue to strive toward both Blackness and Americanness, but can't seem to reconcile the two. And he says, this group has long been internally divided by dilemma as to whether its striving upward should be aimed at strengthening its intercultural and group bonds, both for intrinsic progress and for offensive power against caste, or whether it should seek escape wherever and however possible into the surrounding American culture. Decision in this matter has been lately determined by outer compulsion rather than inner plan. For prolonged policies of segregation and discrimination have involuntarily welded the mass almost into a nation within a nation, with its own schools, churches, hospitals, newspapers, and many business enterprises. The result has been to make American Negroes to wide extent provincial, introvert, self-conscious, and narrowly race loyal. But as a metaphor for a racialized social structure, Du Bois's concept of the veil is going to also be understood as incapacitating other racial groups, including white people. So he gives this 1938 commencement speech at his alma mater, Fisk University. And in it, he says, very, very many colored folk, Japanese, Chinese, Indians, Negroes, and of course, the vast majority of white folk have been so enthused, oppressed, and surpassed by current white civilization that they think and judge everything by its terms. They have no norms that are not set in the 19th and 20th centuries. They can conceive of no future world which is not dominated by present white nations and thoroughly shot through with their ideals, their method of government, their organization, their literature, their art, or in other words, their throttling of democracy, their exploitation of labor, their industrial imperialism, and their color hate. So this racialized social structure for Du Bois, the fact that it's debilitating for whites, that constitutes a significant revision from how he first articulates double consciousness in souls. In that same commencement speech, he goes on, if, however, the effect of the color caste system on the North American Negro has been both good and bad, its effect on white America has been disastrous. It has repeatedly led to the greatest modern attempt at democratic government to deny its political ideals, to falsify its philanthropic assertions, and to make its religion to a great extent hypocritical. So the same racialized social structure that constrains minority groups' recognition of their own humanity also creates for Du Bois among whites an irreconcilable contradiction between what is American racism and what ought to be American democracy, and then prevents the realization of a unified national spirit. Some of Du Bois's contemporaries, like I said, borrow from his conceptualization of duality to parallel the experiences of Black and biracial Americans with that of Jews. But whereas Du Bois understands duality as the result of a racialized social structure, his contemporaries are going to fail to follow suit. The most probably clear example of this is Robert Park and his marginal man thesis. Robert Park borrows extensively from Du Boisian imagery, but when you read his marginal man thesis very closely, it sort of epitomizes this idea of duality as a kind of a pathos. So he argues, for instance, that following their political emancipation, Jews developed a new type of personality. He calls it a cultural hybrid, a man living and sharing intimately in the cultural life and traditions of two distinct peoples. What's the effect of that? Park's Jewish figure can't reconcile their desire to remain Jewish while also wanting to incorporate into the United States. Later, his student, Everett Stonequist, is going to extend that thesis and claim that the marginal man is poised in the psychological uncertainty between two or more social worlds. Stonequist is going to leave no doubt of the degree to which that kind of problem reflects a kind of pathos condition or pathological condition. He says the intensity of the inner conflict varies with the situation itself. But in those cases where the conflict is intense and of considerable duration, the entire personality is oriented around the conflict. And for Stonequist, it's the Jew who's most likely to exhibit these tendencies. He says the Jew is likely to be a typical marginal man. He's the perennial immigrant. His children are apt to have second generation problems. Popularly regarded as a race, the Jews are unassimilable. Centuries of social conflict combined with their tenacious historical memories produce a group consciousness in which in turn resists assimilation and goes beyond that at a certain point. He says it's little wonder then that the Jew becomes the classic illustration of this problem, just as he's been the most articulate in expressing it. So this internal and external conflict that's the hallmark of Park's marginal man thesis, that's going to be apparent to other writers and intellectual figures across the 20th century, including Jews themselves. Jews figure prominently into public discussions of both the intellectual or in both the individual and the nation as multifocal and divisible rather than singular and united. For many mid-20th century intellectuals, the Jew is going to be described as a troubled soul who struggles to traverse between old world and new and therefore struggles for acceptance. It's also around the same time that Jewish social scientists themselves are going to offer up the concept of self-hatred to explain Jewish duality and its effects on the Jewish psyche. So the Jewish psychologist Irving Sarnoff, for example, he argues that Jewish self-hatred is rooted in Jews' identification with their aggressors. Post-World War II America, for Sarnoff, is the perfect ground for self-hatred. So American anti-Semitism is a kind of a racial hatred, and it primes Jews for self-hatred. Elsewhere, the Jewish anthropologist Harold Orlansky locates Jews' marginal status in childhood. He says it's enough to describe the Jewish group as an underprivileged minority. The Jewish child cannot help taking as his own society's evaluation of the Jewish stereotype. We have then the primary form of inferiority and its consequent self-hatred. Even by the end of World War II, beliefs in Jewish inferiority begin to ground popular and scientific perceptions of the Jewish question in Europe and America, and frame Jews' incorporation into the body politic as precarious at best. So these popular and scientific accounts are going to fail to grasp how Jewish duality emerges from having to confront an anti-Semitic society. In contrast to this, Du Bois's theorizing on double consciousness and duality shifts the focus from what is wrong with the Black American to what is wrong with America. Black Americans' inability to reconcile their loyalty to their race with their duties to their nation state, for Du Bois, that's not a psychological matter. That's a distinctly social problem. Meanwhile, for Du Bois, the same white supremacist nation state that produces retrogradation for its victims also does so for the entire society, including white society. I think I'm pretty close to or over my time right now, so I'm gonna stop because I really want to see what kinds of questions you all have. But thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.